do have four really interesting talks on climate change in Northern California this morning, and we're going to start with Jim and Catie Bishop. They've been participants in the GLORIA Great Basin project since the first U.S. summits and are currently on the board of directors. Catie's education background is in biology and botany, and she has experience on the Plumas National Forest as well as some consulting botany. Jim's education is in physical and earth sciences as well as some molecular biology, and he helped develop the tools and methods for the GLORIA surveys. They are currently transitioning from their Sierra West slope home to the eastern side, and this morning we'll be talking about monitoring alpine plants as climate changes, a GLORIA Great Basin update. Welcome, Jim.
That's like magic. Well, I'm glad to be here. Catie and I came to the very first ones of these, and this has certainly grown into quite an event. So it is a well, it's not moving yet, but maybe it will. An update on GLORIA, and just a quick reminder of what that is. It's the Global Observation Research Initiative in Alpine Environments. It was begun, still headquartered in Vienna, Austria, at the University of Vienna. And the idea was to have a methodology that could be applied very inexpensively and very simply across the entire world in alpine environments to look broadly at potential climate change in a very climate-sensitive system. And so we began that in our part of the world in 2004 with summits on the Dunderberg Ridge and in the White Mountains. And we have added to that since then another set in the White Mountains, this time on dolomite or dolostone substrates. The Carson Range south of Lake Tahoe, in Great Basin National Park in the Snake Range, Mount Langley down in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, the Sweetwater Mountains, and the Panamint Mountains. Now, we call this GLORIA Great Basin because that's the single geographic denominator that really covers what we cover here. Some of the Sierran summits are on the western fringe of the Great Basin, and all the other ranges are well within the Great Basin. 29 summits in all, divided among 8 target regions. So a target region in GLORIA speak is a group of summits, 3 or 4, that starts about tree line where the alpine begins and goes up to whatever the highest available summit is. This happens to be our Dolostone Summit series in the White Mountains, and there are the 3 peaks that we survey every 5 years. It begins at the high summit point. That's the origin for the entire system, and goes in each of all 4 aspects. Here I've just illustrated the southerly aspect. And there will be lines that go down the southeast and southwest directions there. There's a perimeter 5 meters below the summit, another perimeter 10 meters below the summit, and at this origin point here, a 3 by 3 meter grid with the outer 4 quadrants, 1 meter square quadrants that are surveyed. And we have added to that basic arrangement in California a 10 meter by 10 meter quadrat with 400 gridded points for point intercept, because we found that in the early going we got pretty inconsistent results in trying to estimate cover within the broad areas. So what we have is a nested series of plots that range from hundreds of square meters to a single square meter that cover pretty well our ability to identify the species and the degree of presence that they have. We also put temperature loggers, 1 on each aspect, 10 centimeters deep in the soil, and they record for several years usually, and then they're dug up and read out. They do not transmit their data. Every now and then a helpful ground squirrel or a marmot or something will help dig it up for you and leave it someplace weird. But we got a lot of temperature data on average soil temperatures, extreme soil temperatures, and snow cover. The California method, as we call it, which is a 10 by 10 plot that we introduced so that we could quantify better the degree of coverage of both plant species and non-plant substrates, is 10 square meters placed. We center it on the same origin point that the 3 by 3 is on. And across it, we stretch 10 1-meter wide lanes. Within each of those, all species are noted, and then 40 points on a half-meter grid for point intercept identify either the species or the nature of the non-plant cover. It's really helped us with our quantification of coverage and the degree of presence of the various plants. The other thing we have introduced is a whole different methodology from GLORIA, although this has been accepted as an option in the International GLORIA Protocol, or downslope surveys. And here's our intrepid botanist, right down where a botanist ought to be, making sure they see everything. This is done 25-meter elevational steps from the summit down. 100-meter long, 1-meter wide belt transect is laid out on contour, divided into 10 segments so that each segment is perfectly analogous to the lanes or segments in the 10 by 10. It's fundamentally the same methodology, just stretched out at a single elevation. And we note every species within the 10-meter segment and then do 40 points on half-meter grid for a total of 400 points on the transect to identify the species or the other non-plant cover. And it works pretty well. We have that on 5 summits within the White Mountains. We basically go from the top all the way down to the bottom of the, as a practical matter, the bottom of the slope. And it gives us a couple of things. One thing it gives us is far better resolution in the vertical than we would get going from one summit to the other. And one example, it's 1,000 feet between the highest summit and the next highest one. And in that same thing, we have a couple dozen transects. The other thing it does is we carried these down into the subalpine, a couple hundred meters. And so that gives us a measure of what's down there that may represent environments that are perhaps going to encroach upon the present alpine zone. So we've gotten a little more popular for doing this. This is the first White Mountain Peaks survey done in 2004. That's the 8 folks that did that. And this is a photo from one of our other outings a couple of years ago in Patriarch Grove up against the Patriarch Tree. And then another one the last time we did the Dunderberg series. And so we have approximately 2 to 3 times as many people on a given survey than we used to. And that's very helpful to make sure you get it done and have lots of eyes looking and hands helping. Training used to be a short powwow on the summit, which said, well, this is kind of what we're going to do, and now let's try it. And that was okay, but you're a little slow sometimes, especially orienting new people. So we've worked at introducing our methodology prior to people going out. And this last year, we were able to lay out some very realistic plots and transects and had people actually go through the process of identifying plants and recording the data. We've also helped 3 other target regions in the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Oregon, and Wyoming, get started. They came to visit us and adopted the methodology and went off and did several more target regions up there. Safety used to be the fond hope that nobody would fall down or get struck by lightning. And now we have a formal program, which we go through in a form of a briefing for each crew before they go out there. We have a specific plan for handling a medical emergency if one should arise. And a couple of our people are certified as wilderness first responders. So somebody on the summit has good training, and we have a halfway respectable first aid kit with us. So hopefully nothing bad will happen, but if it does, we want to be able to respond effectively. Our original organization was very simple. Our founder, Connie Millar, and our first field leader, and Dennis, that's the organizational chart, those 2 boxes. And then you put some volunteers under that. Well, that worked at first, but now that we have 29 summits and 5 downslopes, which is equal to 2 or 3 more summits, and want to keep on track all those years and get something done with the data, we created a nonprofit organization, the GLORIA Great Basin Council. The council consists of a board of directors and the programs. So all of these specific functions now have a person who's responsible for them in a much more formal way. This is our get-together in Boulder a year ago, where we'll be meeting again next week. One of the things that happens is that all the California people spread out, and that's kind of a good thing. We now have associations, close associations via our council members with universities in Montana, Colorado, North Carolina, UC Davis, and the University of Nevada at Reno. And you'll notice the little guy in the green coat in the middle. Now that's just kind of emblematic of our desire to make sure we introduce people fairly young to our process, so that when everybody there gets gray, there'll be somebody to carry it out. The botanical data has improved. This is a picture from the very first survey on Dunderberg Ridge, the evening botany session. Hand lens in the twilight, some newspaper for a couple of samples, and somebody reading the Jepson. And that was pretty good as far as it went, but some of these species are a little tough to make sure you have identified right, taxonomies changed, and so on. So we have progressed, thanks to our botany leader, Jan Knocklinger, who is associated with University of Nevada at Reno, excellent Great Basin botanist, and has carried this forward to where we have good photography, we have excellent comparison with herbarium specimens and up-to-date taxonomy, so that we probably have between 300 and 400 species now that are well classified, and we can count on that. So what kinds of things would you assume about climate change? Well, with warming, things will move up in order to maintain kind of their operating temperature. Roughly speaking, depending on the rate of change you look at, about 15 meters in 5 or 10 years. Warmth would presumably favor more species, and therefore species richness would increase. And as alpine plants move up, so do species from below with the rise of tree lines. But it's not quite that simple. There's a number of things that come into play. As we are finding, the microclimatic niches are numerous, and there's a lot of climate variability within a fairly small region. Warming, instead of making it more hospitable, could dry the soils, reduce nutrient values, and make it less so. Soil development is very slow. There may not be any place to migrate to. The Mediterranean summits in the generally drier areas have not shown species increases. The patterns of dispersal and so on make for a complex picture of how things will change. Alpine plants are a tough lot. They may not give it up quite so easily. Moisture effects could well exceed temperature effects. And our 15 years of surveying a given peak, 15-year interval, is a little short to expect the long-term climate change signature to have emerged from the noise. Early on, we did some very simple analysis and presentations, basically plotting raw data. This is species richness on the vertical against elevation. There are a few trends. For one, there's a general decline in species richness with elevation, which is not a surprise. And if you look, you'll see that the circles and dots pretty well coincide. That represents the species richness we got on 2 successive surveys. And over 5 years, you'd expect that it should be pretty much the same if you're doing your botany in a consistent way. That was from the summits. This is just an example of what we have gained looking at just the raw data of downslope surveys. Here the bars represent pretty close the elevation at which that transect was, above tree line, down into tree line, looking at total low stature plant cover. Everything in the alpine zone is low stature. Coverage was about 20%. Below tree line, it's about a third of that. So it's kind of interesting. The trees were only 15 to 20% cover, yet it cut by a factor of 3 the low plant cover. 2 articles, this one using the downslope surveys, looked at climate niche means, meaning you take a species and you use it to identify the optimal climate in terms of high and low temperature and moisture for a given plant, then use those to characterize the climate niche of a given transect or segment within it, and then ask how well does that correlate with elevation, which broadly speaking is going to be the measure of how climates change. The take-home messages are the climate filtering or patterning is strong at broad scales, such as the entire White Mountain Range. But if you look more closely, like at a given peak, you find out that there are many site-specific factors that dominate the variability. And just to characterize it in a summary, there's as much variation over 100 meters horizontally as there is vertically. So we need to consider the spatial scale we're looking at to really understand the effect of climate change on communities. This study is the most recent one. Here are the co-authors of that. And this was looking at summit areas primarily, looking at 29 summits, the gains and losses in species richness over successive 5-year survey intervals. And there was some look at abundances in both terms of the species, individual species, and in terms of functional groups. And here's sort of the bottom line. There was no significant net change in species richness over that time period. And species richness is not a static thing. It's a dynamic equilibrium where there are both losses and gains, but they have been pretty much offsetting. And there was no clear pattern of who got lost and who didn't, et cetera, that could be clearly attributable to climate change. So once again, it's a fairly complex picture, and a number of things need to be kept in mind as we look into these things and try and interpret the results. Different time scales, resilient plants, and you have to look on a fairly long time scale of probably several decades. So, where did we get? What have we got? Well, we have a long-term project, and if you want high-quality data, you're going to have to look at it for quite a while. We have a mature, well-practiced methodology. We have really good botanical database. We've made good progress in our analysis and the science. We've got dozens of study sites that range from desert sites to high Sierran sites. We got a good measure of the inherent noise in terms of the variability we see. And we have a good organization to sustain the resurveys. And the last thing I'll comment on in an effort to make sure we sustain ourselves is we have created last year the Peak Opportunity Fellowships, which is funding to have a student, three young students join us for a week in the field and kind of come to love this project and carry on with us. Any further information you'd like? GLORIAGreatBasin.org. And with that, I guess I'll try and take some questions. So I'm not sure how this works, but somebody will know. Is there any questions? I see one hand there, and somehow you got to get a microphone, and there it is.
Thank you. Todd Keeler, Wolf Gym. I just had a question about survivorship. Did you look at individuals in terms of, could you actually note them alive or dead or new or diminishing over those periods of time?
In other words, we tracked a given plant for that time? I don't think so, no. One thing we did see, interestingly, one year we had a lot of kill of the shrubs. It happened to be a year with very low snow cover, so they were not snow protected from the extremes of winter cold. That's not individuals, but we did see as a group a genuine loss in survivorship that particular season.
Thanks.
How does the timing of the survey affect your outcome and your results? Spring versus summer versus fall?
We have only done mid and late summer when there's not too much snow and the plants are far enough in their phenological development that we can identify them. So we haven't done between seasons. We've tried to pick a consistent time each year.
And are the data available online?
Yes, and I don't know quite how, but it's all public data, whether it's you get it from the headquarters in Austria or whether you can get it locally. If you'll either contact me or greatbasin.org, I can give you the details.
So when you said that you were using soil probes, was that only at the top of the alpine surveys, or were they on a gradient throughout when you did your transects?
Of the temperature loggers?
The soil probes?
We didn't really do soil probes. Well, what we do is we record the nature of the substrate, and one of the categories is soil, and then there's scree and bedrock.
Okay.
So no sampling of soils. UC Merced came up with us one year, had some soil wizards, and they took some samples, and we haven't talked to them since.
Is there any consideration for adding soils information or soils data for this GLORIA in the future?
I don't know of it.
Okay, thanks.
So. Okay, last question. Wherever.
Could you talk broadly speaking, generally speaking, about why the alpine environment is a good environment to be doing this research in, and why it's important?
Okay, I think I got the question. It's a very climate-sensitive environment. It tends to be a fairly undisturbed environment. It samples all the major climate types, from the Arctic to the equator, continental and maritime types. So it's a good, sensitive ecosystem with much variability. And I stop. The boss said stop. Thank you very much.